So, welcome back. Trust we all had a good break, and raring to go now for the afternoon session here of our symposium. We ended before lunch, for those of you who are here, with I want to say Polish collecting and stylistics, but actually in German porcelain. And continuing the theme then of porcelain, a luxury object or a luxury material, if ever there was one, so difficult to make, the secret of porcelain, endlessly worked on by chemists and scholars trying to copy the Chinese in the West. It's not a material that you necessarily associate with collectivist Soviet Russia. And yet, of course, Soviet porcelain is a major export material collected by museums around the country, and a wonderful kind of integration of the luxurious and the anti-luxurious. And I'm very happy that we have a really excellent speaker here today to bring us into the 20th century, continuing the theme then of design and ostentation with that as our subject matter. So our first speaker this afternoon will be Christianna Bonin, who is a PhD candidate in the History, Theory, and Criticism of Architecture and Art program at MIT. Prior to beginning her doctoral studies, she worked at the Bauhaus-Dessau Foundation in Germany. She received her BA from Amherst College, and she also has an MA in art history from Williams College. Her research considers the relationship amongst industry, economic trade, and culture in late 19th and 20th century Europe and Russia. And her paper today will deal with the contested issue of luxury porcelain production in interwar Soviet Russia. So, Christianna Bonin, thank you.
Thanks so much, Ethan, for that introduction. I'm really pleased to be here and be the second in a 1-2 punch about porcelain. It seems like that rarely happens at conferences, so this is really a treat for me. Okay. So, conjure an image of a Soviet proletarian worker between the two world wars. Your image, I venture, will be shaped by at least two mass media machines. The first, the copious prints produced by the Soviet state, and the second, the results of a quick Google image search. Perhaps your worker resembles these on the screen, red-tinged, svelte men and women wielding the tools of their progressive trades. Or perhaps your image resembles this photograph of the scarcity that pockmarked the Union's massive industrialization push of the 1930s. I would venture, however, that your proletariat is not attentively brandishing a ceremonial porcelain vase, as in this image from 1927. This is the cover of an intriguing book by Anatoly Lunacharsky titled Sovietsky Farfor, or Soviet Porcelain. Lunacharsky, who was chair of the institution Narkompros, or the Commissariat of the Enlightenment, addressed the book to the former imperial porcelain manufactory in Leningrad. Although the manufactory had continued to produce porcelain dishware after the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, by 1927 it was facing financial hardship. The central question of Lunacharsky's book was twofold. First, as the title suggests, should porcelain objects become Soviet, that is, transformed into a useful and hence valuable good for the proletariat? And if so, how? After all, and as we heard this morning, conventionally in imperial court society, porcelain had been considered a luxury good, which meant that its value derived more from political or social necessities of elite exchange than the labor invested by its non-elite makers, a position antithetical to the ideology supporting the first worker state. Porcelain's problem in the socialist context, as Lunacharsky conceded, was that the manufactory, and I quote, was of course an aristocratic court idea to imitate Western European courts and be better than them. However, his proposal was not, in his words, to simply retain the factory and change its profile for more utilitarian work, something Soviet authorities considered after the revolution, he said. Instead, Soviet porcelain would be, and I quote, porcelain preserved as an artistic unit, considering its higher results. Here, porcelain becomes valuable to socialism because it can stand apart from everyday, more explicitly purposeful objects and exist as something with, at least for Lunacharsky, more ambiguous function and value, as art. This gives us an interesting opening onto the issue of excess in interwar Soviet Russia, a state premised at least in theory on the egalitarian distribution of resources among its citizens. Undergirding Lunacharsky's book was an assumption that porcelain, as both a material and a historical body of objects, was not yet an extant integral part of the Soviet context, and instead existed as excess, as a mode of production remaining from the Tsarist period, somehow unable to be absorbed as culturally or economically integral to art making or industry, and excluding the working class. Hence, Sovietsky Farfor provides an opportunity to ask how and why porcelain could fit into Marxist thought and actually existing socialism. What is its mode of production, what is its mode of operation, its structures of power, and its presumed and assumed subject positions? What surprised me in pursuing these questions was that Lunacharsky's position was neither unique nor uncontested among his contemporaries. For example, the same year of Sovietsky Farfor's publication, Nikolai Kachalov, an expert in ceramic production, published Farfor Yiyo Izgatovlenia, Porcelain and Its Manufacture. This book elucidates porcelain manufacture at a mass scale, a developing but not yet robust mode of production at the Leningrad manufactory. He argued that ceramicists should discard their earlier efforts to create socially engaged art because art remained an elitist pursuit. He promoted technical porcelain, industrial enamel, a laboratory beaker, porcelain with practical implications for the wider world, not porcelain as excessive but rather abundantly integral to the socialist project. His conclusion to the section, Purpose of Porcelain, encapsulates this view. There is a widely held erroneous notion that the main purpose of porcelain lies in the service of artistic activities of the population, for the production of richly painted vases, dainty services, statuettes, and so on. We cannot agree that, as if a decorative material, porcelain is incapable. In fact, porcelain plays an incomparably more important role in the history of human culture as a material entirely indispensable to many branches of technics. Both Lunacharsky and Kachalov attempted to make porcelain work, that is, to contend with Russia's historical baggage and actually existing socialism. Lunacharsky did so by circumscribing porcelain as art, Kachalov as progressive technology. These two perspectives form the dialectic at the core of my paper, which aims to reveal that the art-technology-porcelain binary is neither simple nor fixed. As I'll share with you this afternoon, porcelain objects in the Leningrad manufactory were surprising staging grounds through which cultural commentators, political officials, and ceramicists represented their society's struggle between eliminating class distinctions and maintaining structures of power, between promoting images of egalitarianism, industrial prowess, and abundance on the world stage. I argue that porcelain in the interwar period never lost neither its status as a luxury good, nor its historical function as a medium of international exchange. Instead, porcelain held potential within the socialist context as a discursive counterweight. It could alternatively be construed as a fragile, superabundant object for display or export as art abroad, as it did here in the first international exhibition of Russian art in Berlin, or as I'll discuss later, via the gilded souvenir in tourist service. It's here at the Cooper Hewitt. Porcelain also became a medium for introducing individual artists to collective production, as with this dishware service by Vasily Kandinsky or Alexander Rodchenko. And finally, porcelain was a robust material for industry, as we see in this Leningrad manufactory publication. This paper aims to expand discussion of Soviet art to more fully incorporate the markets and media present in the interwar art world. We are familiar with the photographs and paintings by Rodchenko or Malevich, yet we rarely question why and how those artists designed for porcelain at the Leningrad manufactory. In fact, examining Soviet painting apart from porcelain erects a false binary between art and craft. It reinforces a time-worn post-Kantian view of fine art in the West, which privileges ostensibly autonomous artistic media over functional, reproducible objects. Because porcelain objects regularly derive value from their use in the demands of the market, they are codified as craft. But studying porcelain gives us a new lens into a well-studied subject, Soviet art, allowing us to see actually how that concept, that category, came into being. As art historian Christina Kyer helps me to address, interwar Soviet artists created multivalent objects, such as Rodchenko's packaging for the Red October chocolate factory caramels. Here, even sweet, indulgent consumption can further the socialist project. For Kyer, this packaging constitutes a so-called socialist object of the new economic period, a semi-capitalist era from 1921 to 27, because this object negotiated rather than opposed capitalist consumption. Porcelain remains outside Kyer's argument, but her work points to a need for an expanded theory of interwar Soviet art making, one that accommodates objects like porcelain, which often circulated outside the USSR in exhibitions in Western capitalist markets. So on one level, the problem of socializing porcelain arises in the attempts to situate the Leningrad manufactory within the Soviet bureaucracy after the revolution. Between 1917 and 1924, the manufactory's administration changed at least 5 times, moving from the Ministry of Trade and Industry's mining department to the People's Commissariat for Agriculture's mining department to the Narkompros's Academic Center for Scientific and Artistic Establishments to the All-Union Commissariat of the Economy, and finally back to Narkompros. These relocations signify, certainly, a revolutionary government in flux. Crucial to my argument, however, is that they also reveal a state constantly reevaluating porcelain. Was it a raw material to be readied for trade? A finished work of art? Both? A porcelain dish by Anton Komashka exemplifies this ambiguity. The ceramicist is a revolutionary iconoclast carrying a sickle, standing adjacent to what may be shards of porcelain. But he is also a producer of mass goods standing before a factory. Finally, he is one of several craftsmen who bend over a row of porcelain objects. Their work is handwork. All of this is depicted on a gilded and silver porcelain plate unaffordable to most of the proletariat it celebrates. Consider this object as we recall the 2 perspectives with which I began. If both Lunacharsky and Kochalov found in porcelain an alienated mode of elite consumption, they also found an ideal Marxist mode of production. However, they did so on different terms. Within Marxist thought, labor should be thought of as a matter of self-expression. The ideal is that of a fine craftsman, or even more, an artist, whose work is both an expression of her inner being and a contribution to society. However, Marxist thought also considers mechanized industrialization as necessary for any advanced form of political resistance to emerge. Lunacharsky envisioned porcelain moving towards self-expressive art by describing it as handmade, and hence distinguished from repetitive industrial labor. In doing so, he challenged porcelain's typical status in Western post-Kantian aesthetic theory as craft and therefore opposed to art, which is expected to be autonomous. Viewed against industrial production, porcelain acquired positive qualities as a craft and in turn approached art. However, Kochalov imagined utilitarian porcelain supporting Soviet Russia's industrial modernity. In other words, the precise features that make porcelain sometimes craft and art and technical industry were signs that porcelain production in Soviet Russia was not just possible, but necessary to producing a Soviet artist subject and consumer. Nonetheless, many avant-garde artists and critics of the 1920s despised ceramics, especially porcelain, for its unsavory associations with bourgeois consumers. The critic Sergei Tretyakov exemplified these feelings with a derogatory caricature of the netman, who was a profiteer unique to the NEP period. Tretyakov imagined the netmen living in cozy apartments made habitable by porcelain elephants and sometimes even plates from the Soviet porcelain factory with the slogan, "He who works shall eat." Tretyakov's anxiety grew from his experience of an emerging bourgeois patron. He feared that art would continue to be characterized by the decorative and allegedly useless objects, here epitomized by porcelain. For those who envisioned Soviet art as utilitarian and somehow robust, made of steel or flexible fabric, porcelain remained a semantically untidy medium. In this dish that you see here, Tretyakov saw socialism as a mere aesthetic, forced to accommodate itself to an imperial medium. And with reason, Tretyakov also accused ceramicists in Leningrad of doing little to ally their work to the domestic context. Manufactory archives confirm that the liveliest trade in artistic porcelain in the 1920s existed between the Leningrad manufactory, state bodies, and European dealers abroad. Juxtaposed against Tretyakov's desired socialist media, porcelain failed to communicate utilitarian value and was read as excess. However, I argue that this limited view of porcelain does not hold. Examining some key exhibitions and the process of production actually at the manufactory reveals that as the authorial function of the individual creator was undercut through the Soviet ideal of the collective and industrial fabrication, porcelain became an ideal medium of socialist art. On August 3rd, 1919, the first extensive exhibition of Soviet-made porcelain opened in St. Petersburg at the Myaidlev House, an imposing palace located at the heart of the city. The grand affair featured 400 Soviet-made porcelain works displayed among crystal chandeliers and Corinthian columns. Visitors encountered a bust of Marx and a number of dishes and vases with images heralding Soviet industrialization. A red banner crowned the display, "Long live artistic creative labor." In this staging of porcelain as Soviet and artistic labor, the exhibition's organizers argued that that porcelain held utility for the workers beyond meeting their essential needs. The exhibition not only propagated slogans to local audiences as proof of the state's promising future, as the few current historical commentaries on Soviet-made porcelain usually argue. Rather, in demonstrating the organizers' ability to reuse imperial space, the exhibition argued that socialism finally offered the conditions for porcelain artisans to restage themselves creatively as artists. Long live artistic creative labor. One critic praised the exhibition on these terms. Of all the various manifestations of contemporary fine art, only the porcelain factory has been able to find new paths and new forms of painting which will go down in the history of art under the title of a proletarian style. In this narrative, porcelain production debuted as a way for non-elite artisans to finally create on their own terms rather than those of serving a court, for example. However, the display remained aristocratic in design, as if impressing upon the artists as well as visitors its superiority and standing. The view of porcelain as art also emerged from the production process and the designers the factory engaged. Consider in this regard two dishes, dynamic composition and suprematist composition, which Alexander Kudryavtsev painted in 1923 after two designs by Malevich. Kudryavtsev translated one-to-one Malevich's colored shapes into polychrome overglaze painting on porcelain. He also repeated the faint pencil line Malevich used to frame his design. This inclusion, I think, has two important effects. First, the penciled rectangle on the paper design suggests that Malevich thought of his proposal in 2 dimensions rather than 3, that is, of porcelain as a flat surface like a canvas or a piece of paper rather than an object to be handled. The corners of the painted image extend over the plate's central crevice and into the rim, ignoring the given form. The repeated frame also announces the design's origin as a drawing. Multiple marks on each plate's base reinforce the connection to the original. Alongside a black square suprematist brand mark, these two dishes also carried the label suprematism from a drawing by Malevich. Here, the hand of a porcelain artisan constructs and reinforces Malevich as the artist-author. And dynamic composition is just one of several objects from the Leningrad manufactory in the early 1920s that reproduces images by modern artists, whom the manufactory had hired to transform the artist's practices into a more collaborative artisanal mode of production. However, the artist contracts reveal a more complex treatment of artist and artisan. One contract with an artisan, Mikhail Avdanovich, from 1922 reveals that the artist should paint his compositions on 1 to 5 objects per month in the manufactory. In reality, however, the artist did not always execute the porcelain painting, as most lacked the skill to do so. The artist's pay schedule also differed from that of the artisans in that it was structured according to, and this is the word they use, the uniqueness of each composition. These details reveal that the manufactory socialized art production by bringing it into the space of the craft manufactory. At the same time, the manufactory reinforced unique expression through repetitive marks of authorship on the porcelain. Porcelain became autonomous art because artists made it, but it became socialist because it was produced collaboratively in the manufactory. This dual status allowed both artisans and ceramicists to, at least rhetorically, circumvent the critique that their objects remained excessive and subject to capitalist market structures. If Soviet porcelain was understood in this hybrid socialized aesthetic frame, its meaning changed when displayed abroad. In this 1922 Erste Russische Kunstausstellung in Berlin, porcelain by Suyetin, Kandinsky, and several others appeared alongside paintings by Malevich and Rodchenko. However, the attempt to present porcelain as art only partially succeeded. The catalog introduction describes porcelain as, quote, experiments in a kind of productive work that is connected with art. Yet the inventory catalyzed porcelain works as decorative and distinct from the modern art section or sculpture. You also notice that the artworks are given authors' names while the porcelain is not given an artist's name. Compared with industrial production in the Soviet context, porcelain was art. But when compared to modern art in Western markets and communicating its socialist origins, it moved back in the realm of decorative craft. Caught in these aesthetic and economic crosshairs, the manufactory produced only mediocre sales in internal and external markets in the early 1920s. By 1928, a variety of factors, such as the first 5-year plan's forced end to the NEP period and state efforts to coordinate a centralized art system, led to a reconsideration of the porcelain trade. Leaders of Narkompros asked, should artistic porcelain remain a good that flows as capital in long-distance commodity exchanges? How could it speak to the Soviet masses? In his conclusion to Sovietsky Farfor, Lunacharsky proposed a solution: create a proletarian subject who values and hence absorbs porcelain back into the socialist context. He used an image of a fragile yet praiseworthy kind of porcelain to characterize this new revolutionary subject. It seems that the thunderous revolution and its titanic struggles should have broken into shards the object of such fragile value, and so alienated from the masses. Also whole galleries of pictures and sculptures. But this did not happen. Of course, in remote states and the provinces, many possessions of the odious rich and propertied class were destroyed, and in turn, many precious and interesting things were destroyed, including porcelain. But in general, we can be surprised by the solicitude with which the Great Revolution protected artistic values, with how much care and work was devoted to saving it, the manufactory, by the distinguished people who went on to direct it. In these lines, Lunacharsky constructs two revolutionary subjects. We have to imagine one as refined and provincial, smashing through an aristocratic interior. The other, of course, appears on our cover. This is not a vase cloistered in a netman's vitrine. This is a vase in the hands of a worker who knows how to physically and intellectually handle the artifacts of art's history. Demonstrations of revolutionary solicitude filled the publication. A photograph of the manufactory's museum shows imperial ceremonial vases on pedestals, stacks of plates and cups, and carefully placed protective stanchions. This display was not unique to the manufactory. Many palaces, including the Alexander and Winter palaces in St. Petersburg, were looted during the revolution, only to be restored and opened to the growing number of Soviet and Western visitors in the late 1920s. Lunacharsky used his essay on porcelain to shape a key debate in the late 1920s around the concept of culturedness, or kulturnost. This was the state's civilizing mission to increase levels of literacy and knowledge, hygiene and behavior, and sociopolitical activism among the peasants and working class through institutions such as museums. Also in Sovietsky Farfor, the bookishness of the proletariat emerged as a core quality of this new Soviet subject. The emerging solicitous Soviet subject also coincided with the regime's Great Break policy, which denied Soviet society the agency gathered from past generations in exchange with the industrial West, an agency that, as we have seen, sustained porcelain production. Devin Fourier has argued that Stalinist attempts to liquidate history from social practice counter a larger discourse around the concept of zabota, or care. In Lenin's 1919 text, A Great Start, the socialist community must entail care not simply for one's neighbors, blizhnya, but also to incorporate the farther ones, dalnya, and that's a term that Lenin drew from Nietzsche. This action demonstrates a person's ability to understand worlds outside of her own subjectivity. Zabota constitutes revolutionary communist affect, which would supersede institutional or religious definitions of society to create a holistic community. The cover of Sovietsky Farfor exemplifies an image of concern for art's farthest ones. For it is Zabota, according to Lunacharsky, he uses that term, that the proletariat showed to porcelain objects past and present, abroad and domestic. He wrote that the success of our works abroad was proof that their artistic meaning is understandable to those who are alien to us, and that seems like an even sharper sign of artistic progress. Porcelain, the farthest one of both art and industry, is here uniquely capable of building an effective socialist community. Let me begin my final section by recalling my initial thesis. To legitimate porcelain as a mode of production in the socialist context, its makers and commentators had to maneuver between the medium's identity as artistic and industrial product. A little-known design for a porcelain plate refracts this tension. The drawing depicts a strident ceramicist stationed among his flaming attributes, stacks and trays of porcelain forms, each labeled with a dynamic red banner. Cutting across the upper edge of the central image is a perspective of the manufactory. Its neoclassical stucco facade here has now been transformed into a steely machinic blue-gray surface. Artistic porcelain, painted vases and plates appear encased in a verdant wreath that distinguishes them from the technical, industrial porcelain and enamels. As the worker gestures towards the technical, we catch sight of the encroaching pressure not only to promote an image of technical porcelain, but to actually mass produce it. To highlight this pressure is to enter into the impassioned debates of the 1930s regarding the demonstration of Soviet superiority on the world stage. Retracting from a decade of importing foreign expertise and technology from Western countries, the party began to build a national patriotic base. This willed break and the decade's forced industrialization appeared in the Soviet push to restore porcelain's stakes in supporting domestic tasks. A lengthy 1939 publication from the Leningrad manufactory titled Technicheski Farfor, Technical Porcelain, confirms this view, stating that the main goal of porcelain production since 1929 had been to, quote, free the country from the import of technical porcelain. Although the rhetoric of Soviet self-sufficiency through mass production intensified, the production of porcelain and exchange with Western consumers did not end. Instead, the rubrics of production and consumption shifted conceptually. By the 1930s, Soviet porcelain was rarely associated with creative art. Instead, it was idealized as authentic Soviet craft, which legitimated porcelain's continued production as a counterpoint to a period overwhelmed by turbo-industrialization. Uh-oh. Let us go to the Intourist tea service to explore the intertwining narratives of authenticity, craft, and technology that I'm mentioning above. The name Intourist refers to the state tourist agency established in 1929 to regulate foreign trade. In turn, each object pairs two monumental sites in St. Petersburg, often shown to Soviet and foreign visitors, one image in polychromy and the other decontextualized and magnificently gilded. Generally, the gilded side displays Russian imperial sites, while the polychrome monuments maintain a more direct connection with Soviet history. Banners and ropes on the handles, spouts, and lids visually connect both sides. Designed by Eva Zeisel in 1932, the form marked a change to the manufacturer's lineup. With flattened indentations along the drops of the lids, as well as thicker spouts and handles proportional to the body of the vessel, the pared-down forms stabilized the pieces for transport. Rather than often thinner, sinewy shapes of historic imperial porcelain, these formal changes support the modernist belief that primary shapes best suit mass-scale production. However, the service was never mass-produced, and it's likely that less than 100 exemplars were made. It also remained hand-painted and was promoted as such. Continuing the imperial practice of depicting images of key historical monuments on porcelain, other versions of Zeisel's set featured kindergartens, the new Moscow metro, or town settlements in Siberia. I love the kindergarten. The tea services were distributed primarily in hotels and stores open to foreigners and ranking party members. Indeed, Joseph Davies and Marjorie Post, millionaires and U.S. ambassadors to Soviet Russia, procured a version of this service as a souvenir of their diplomatic visit to the Leningrad manufactory in 1937. By the mid-1930s, the customized tourist good like the Intourist porcelain service had become the lingua franca of U.S.-Soviet exchange. Advertisements, such as this one for a Torgsen or Trade with Foreigners store, promoted high-quality goods at low prices. This advertisement encapsulates a crucial transition in the nature of exchange between producers and consumers of porcelain objects. To build on theorist Arjun Appadurai, when the mobility of luxury commodities become more apparent in upper-class circles, and as technology permits the multiplication of prestige objects, the distance between the object's consumers and producers appears to decrease. Porcelain, once scarce and used only in exchanges between individuals and select institutions, had become more available to tourists in the 1930s through the massive export of art to the West. In turn, the issue of exclusivity of a good becomes an issue of preserving its authenticity. Advertisements in popular Soviet tourist magazines reconfirmed that the visitor could in fact find authentic porcelain in Soviet Russia, in particular in manufactories and museum displays. Manufactory promotional materials featured images of women hand-painting porcelain, as you see here. An article on the Museum of Ceramics in Moscow includes one of Zeisel's forms, which visitors could find alongside a Ming vase. The industrial form here, amazingly, appears in a pre-industrial history. To conclude, the in-tourist tea service emerged from a strategic navigation. Soviet authenticity was crafted through a medium that theretofore had participated in an elite capitalist semiotic system of status. The in-tourist service juxtaposition of ornate imagery and abstracted forms exemplifies how, at that time, porcelain became a supreme medium for showcasing Soviet abundance and a parsimonious use of materials that Western consumers expected of a veritable socialist state. At last, porcelain, as excess now integrated into Soviet art history, paradoxically approaches not the proletariat, but the world outside as homespun Soviet. Thank you.